So the rest of today is really going to be on these exploration movements, especially how the new Iberian governments get going in the late 1400s on these exploration projects, and especially what the Spanish do with that, as the Spanish go out and conquer big chunks of the Americas and empower themselves to try to do a big takeover of much of Europe, also in the 1500s. But a lot of this starts off when the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, the big Muslim kingdom, at this point in history, conquers Constantinople in the mid-1400s, in 1455, I think, 53, which is here on this map, right in the center, in the place called Istanbul. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire had been shrinking over time. Their land had been getting conquered piece by piece by piece over hundreds of years. And Constantinople was really the last part of the Byzantine Empire, the last sector of it. And the Ottoman attack in the 1450s finally conquers the city. Different Muslim kingdoms and emperors, call themselves different things, caliphs, had been trying to conquer Constantinople for hundreds of years. They tried it several times, and each time it failed. But they finally conquered the city in the 1450s, which ends the Byzantine Empire, just kills it, extinguishes it. And they renamed the city Istanbul, and because the place was so hard to conquer in the first place, the Ottoman Empire moved their capital to Istanbul, and will remain their capital really for the rest of their existence. And the Ottoman Empire goes on for hundreds more years. Ottoman Empire survives until World War I. That's the war that destroyed them and split their holdings up into all these different independent countries. Many of them we still have today. The fact that the Ottomans conquered Constantinople is not just important for the end of Byzantine history, but also important for Europe's economic development, because a lot of European traders used to travel through Constantinople and through Anatolia, that peninsula, and they would try to avoid the Ottoman Empire as much as they could, but they would try to get down into what on this map is like Baghdad, and it's labeled on this map, the Safavid Empire. It's basically old Persia. And from there would often continue traveling further east into northern India along the Silk Road. And sometimes even further east than that, and get all the way to China to buy up Chinese goods like porcelain and silk and whatnot. And Constantinople is like the last big European city before you get into those areas. So a lot of European traders went through Constantinople. And when the Ottomans conquered the city, they realized that there's all these European companies, travelers, traders coming through with huge amounts of money. And the Ottoman Empire looks to tax them. And they do. They raise taxes on foreign travelers. And they start making a huge amount of money off of that tax. The Ottoman government gains huge revenue, which they very often use to build up their armies and continue tacking further and further west into Europe. So the Ottomans are at really the height of their power at this moment, right around the year 1500. And they eventually attack into Greece, and they attack up what we call southeastern Europe, and they get close to Austria. So at any one point or so over the next few hundred years, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, owns and controls land in Eastern Europe quite a lot, and the Europeans will be constantly afraid of a future gigantic tidal wave attack of the Muslim armies that would conquer all of Europe and Christianity. So that's another important thing about Constantinople. Europeans often use that city as like the last stand to keep the Muslims out of Europe. And when the Ottoman Empire conquered the city, that kind of opened the floodgates to other invasions of Europe. Is that clear? And that's two of the things that the Europeans are always afraid of, the increased taxes that enriches the Ottomans, and that they use that money to keep attacking Europe. So the Europeans, by and large, when Constantinople falls, a lot of Europeans start trying to think of other ways to get to Persia or India or China, where they could just bypass the Ottoman Empire, because they don't want to fund their own destruction. They don't want to give money to their enemy, because their enemy is going to use the money to attack them. They understand that. Does that make sense? So they start looking for other routes. And in the late 1400s is when what we today recognize as almost like a Spanish Revolution, to kick attack the Muslim empire that's in Iberia and kick them out, so that Spain can basically become its own country. And the country along the western coastline is called Portugal. So these are two kind of newly independent countries in the late 1400s. And the early kind of Portuguese leaders, even before that, have been trying to explore parts of Africa for a long time. So Portugal, this western country in Iberia, has been sending boats out of Europe and traveling along the North African coastline, basically. And their goal in the 1400s seems to have been to find native African groups that they can form military alliances with and attack the Muslim empire in North Africa from behind. That didn't work. But the Portuguese do accomplish at least getting the first steps going in mapping out some of the North African coastline kind of consistently as they travel, really only about the level of the Sahara Desert. But that's further than most Europeans have traveled in a long time. So the Portuguese at first have the best maps. And Portugal, the government, as it comes into existence in the 1400s, starts basically advertising for explorers in Europe. The idea is explorers from Europe come to Portugal, and the Portuguese government will listen to your sales pitch. The Portuguese government is looking to fund explorations to figure out how to get to India. Right? Does that make sense? Especially India. So there's all these kind of adventurers from all over Europe coming to Portugal to make their sales pitch, hoping to get government funding for their project. Right? All right. There's two of these guys, most famously. Guy's name is Cristobal Colon, and he's from, I believe it's Genoa, one of the northern Italian city-states. And his sales pitch is to get some boats and sail directly west, out into the ocean. And to go back to the map real quick, the Europeans, by and large, do not know that these American continents exist. They think it's kind of open water. Colon says, therefore, that he wants to get some boats, government funding, and sail directly west and end up somewhere out here in China. Other people have had that idea before, but it's not easy because it's so much water to cross. It takes so much time. Colon's idea is a little bit different, though, because he says, according to his mathematical studies, he thinks the world is smaller than it actually is by like 8,000 miles. So he says, yes, you've heard this plan before, but all those other guys, they wanted enough funding to travel like 25,000 miles to get to China, which would be really, really expensive. He says, according to my research, the world isn't really that big. It's only 17,000 miles. Does it make sense? So he says, I'm a bargain. You don't have to give me as much money, as much funding, as much, food and supplies and whatnot for this voyage. Yeah.
So before him, there was never an exploration on the Americas?
not from Portugal. We think that there were maybe some Vikings or something that kind of poked and prodded around. There might have been other individual voyagers who had made it there. A lot of them haven't made it back. But the key is they hadn't done so with government support, which means if they found the secret, they kept it to themselves, right?
They had already explored South America, right?
No.
No.
We think that for European explorers, at least, the best that they really get to is maybe up here, what is today kind of very eastern Canada. But without government support, no governments were willing to kind of scale that up to continue the explorations to really map the place out. So there's a lot of argument, who was the first to actually find the place, and that could go all the way back to the Vikings. I mean, who knows? But it seems to be that government support is key because they're the ones who have enough money to keep doing it repeatedly and build up trade routes and whatnot to kind of stabilize it. If it's just an individual group out there, maybe they find something and just keep the secret to themselves for whatever reasons. Money or some place to hide or something, who knows. Other questions? So Colomb makes the argument that the world is not 25,000 miles around, it's actually in like 17. When he has this meeting with the Portuguese king, it's not just the king and his family. They have their own scientific advisors, like mathematical experts. So Colomb comes in with his maps, gives his sales pitch, and leaves the room, and they hold a little discussion about, is this idea true or not? And the scientific advisors tell the king right there, this guy's numbers are off. You give him enough supplies to go that distance that he's planning on, they ain't going to make it. Because all scientific evidence that we have shows us that the world is bigger than he thinks it is. So what's going to happen if you give him ships and crews and food and whatnot?
Run out.
Yeah, they're going to run out. Probably out there in the middle of the ocean somewhere. They're all going to die. If you give him that money, you might as well just burn it. You're never going to see it again. It's not going to. They're not going to get any result out of it. They're going to go out there and die somewhere. So the Portuguese king's advisors say, don't fund this guy. He's too risky. He's dangerous. And the king agrees. So they bring in the next guy named Diaz, and he proposes going a different direction. He doesn't want to go west. He wants to go south. His sales pitch is, we've already been kind of exploring this area around northern Africa, but we don't know where that land ends or if we can get around it to go to India. We know India is out there to the east somewhere. So he says, I want to take government funding and get some ships together and sail south and basically follow the African coastline and see if there's a water route around it at some point so it can eventually turn eastward and go to India. Does that make sense? And the advisors listen to this and they say, well, this is much more doable than Colomb's idea, so let's fund this guy instead. And they give him the money and ships, and he and his guys set sail in 1487. And they basically hug the coastline. They don't want to get away from it because if you lose sight of the land, you're going to get lost. So they really go right along the coastline, all the way down to what we today recognize as the southern tip of Africa. And it takes them a year to get to that point. So when they turn the corner and they realize that this is open ocean in front of them, Diaz gets all excited. He says, all right, we're on our way to India. And the crew says, no, we've been at this for a year. We found what we came here to find, so let's go home. So there's an argument that breaks out, and it appears to be that the crew said to Diaz, you're going to turn this boat around and send us home. If you don't want to do that, we'll kill you and throw you overboard. Then we'll turn the boat around and go back home. So Diaz agreed with that. At that point, they turned around and go back home. So Diaz comes back and kind of turns this secret information over to the government. Secret gets out pretty quick. And Diaz and his crew are celebrated, and the Portuguese government will continue funding more explorations of the African coastline. They eventually go all the way to India, and they say they found the great secret, the water passage to India, which gets Europeans to India faster because they're traveling over water, and cheaper because they're getting there quicker. They don't need as many supplies as you would need to get on that road and go all the way there. Does that make sense? And this is like a Portuguese government national secret. If you can get your boats into India faster than anyone else, and you know how to get there and no one else does, you can get your traders into India, you can buy up a bunch of, and China, and bring back those goods to Portugal and the European markets and sell them for astronomical profit. I mean, people become millionaires off this stuff by being investors in these explorations, these trading companies. And the Portuguese government will tax those transactions and those companies and build up huge revenue, and Portugal can become one of the richest governments in the world. Does it make sense? So this is a state-sponsored, government-sponsored exploration to build up the Portuguese economy, basically. It's government-funded research, really. And Diaz becomes very famous for this and is celebrated basically for the rest of his life. So the Portuguese are exploring around Africa for the next, and going to India for the next few decades. Colón, though, is kind of left out in the cold. He's kind of pissed off about this. Portugal on this map is here. It's a kingdom. It's on the western coast of Iberia. And Spain is a newly unified kingdom also in these few years, the late 1480s, early 1490s. They're in the process of fighting the Muslim Moors and pushing them into North Africa, pushing them out of what is today Spain. So Colón, he didn't get the funding from Portugal. And right when Portugal gets going with this, Spain wants to do the same thing, for the same reason, to grow their economy. So Colón takes his sales pitch and he goes to the new Spanish government, the king and queen, and their advisors, and gives the exact same sales pitch. He says, the world is, I believe it's smaller than most scientists believe, most mathematicians. I won't ask for as much money as anyone else that wants to travel straight westward. And it's the exact same idea. And he leaves the room and they consult the advisors and the monarchs. And the advisors, by and large, say the exact same thing. This guy's numbers are off. You give this guy money and funding, you might as well burn it, because they're going to go out there in the ocean somewhere and die, because they're not going to have enough food to make it all the way. But after the meeting, one advisor goes to the king and queen and says, in a closed-door meeting, yes, most likely his numbers are off, and he's going to go out there and die somewhere. And everyone who goes with him, you're never going to hear from him again, probably. Then he says, what if? What if he's actually right? And you can get the secret to get to India faster than anyone, even in Portugal. This advisor says it's worth the risk of investment. We'll give him some money, we'll give him some ships and some crew and supplies. And yes, it'll probably be a waste. But if he's right, and you can now get to India faster than anyone else in Europe, Spain will be the center of the European economy, will be the most prosperous place, and possibly grow itself into being the most powerful country in the world. So this advisor says, you've got some money left over, why not? Why not try it? There's no risk to you, really. Does that make sense? So the Spanish government agrees to fund Colón's expedition, and they set sail in, I think it's August of 1492. And they first sail south from Spain down to a Spanish colony, a little island system here, and then they resupply there, and they turn their boats directly west, and they go for it. And most historians believe that Colón ends up landing after a couple months, in October, ends up landing somewhere in either what is today Haiti, the Dominican Republic, this big island, or maybe Cuba. What is today Cuba? Either way, he doesn't think he's here in the world. He thinks the world's smaller than it is, right? He thinks he's out here on this Philippine Islands, or he might even think he's in Japan. He doesn't really know. But he runs into native people on these islands. They're darker skinned, they're speaking a language he doesn't understand, so he thinks he's actually in India, like an island off India somewhere. And so he calls them Indians. And people keep making that mistake. They're not Indians. They're not in India. Colon, goes ashore and negotiates and tries to get some of the Spanish people to learn that language so they can communicate. And they trade some things. He buys up some native plants and uproots some native plants, puts them on his boat. Even takes a couple native people and puts them on his boat and goes back to Spain. And announces basically to the Spanish government and the rest of the world that he has found the secret passage to India. And he believes that for the rest of his life. He believes that he's landed in India. His desire seems to be, from the documents, from his writings that we have, he thinks that the Spanish government is going to go out and colonize whatever he's found and make him royal governor over the place, and he's going to start his own company, and he's going to be his company can be the only one that's going to bring resources out of the colony and sell them in Europe. He thinks he's going to get really rich off of this. He eventually doesn't. In fact, dies poor. But once he gets back, the Spanish government starts giving funding to a lot of different explorers to kind of repeat the voyage and try to map this place and figure out what's going on, where this place is. Nearly all the scientific advisors think that Colon has found a new place that they didn't even know about, just because of the length of the voyage. They think he wasn't sailing long enough to get to the southern part of the world. But Colon believes to his dying day that he's found the secret passage to India. And the Spanish will repeat their explorations and kind of poke and prod around this whole area that we today call the Caribbean and Florida and eventually the kind of Central American coastline, just trying to map where land is and kinds of things. And they'll eventually start attacking native groups and colonizing land and enslaving natives. And Colon takes part in that over the next 10 years or so. And he treats the natives so badly that even amongst other colonizers and slaveholders, he does things that are so horrible to the natives that the Spanish imprison him and send him back in Spain in a prison ship, basically, to go on trial. So he doesn't treat the natives well at all, or even mercifully at all. Does that make sense? But the word is out by 1495 or so that this is going on, and then Portugal starts sending other boats all over the area, and other European governments will start sending. England and France and the Dutch will start sending boats to explore, and they'll basically get into warfare against each other, fighting over trading routes and colonies and whatnot. Does that make sense? All right. And the fighting gets really so bad, especially between Spanish employees, Spanish mercenaries, and Portuguese mercenaries and explorers. They're kind of all lumped together. Remember, this is open water. No one really controls it. So there's piracy, there's theft and murder. I mean, this is like the wild, wild west of the time. And most of these ship captains are really in it for their own enrichment, so they'll kill each other over small amounts of money, even sink each other's boats and do all kinds of things. The warfare, and sometimes it's not even official war, they're just out there competing against each other and doing all this damage to each other. It gets so violent out there for the Europeans fighting amongst themselves that eventually the leaders of Spain and Portugal, they try to figure out some kind of treaty system to divide their discoveries between themselves. And they're both very staunchly followers of the Pope's church. So they called the Pope on his cell phone one day and asked him to come up with some kind of map treaty system to divide all this. To basically everyone can stay on their own side and you can avoid this massive amount of fighting. And the Pope broke out a map and basically figured that, the Portuguese have been kind of milling around Africa for the most part. They got that going. And the Spanish are kind of exploring further west, so he's just said, draw a line right down the middle of the ocean. Spain gets to stay on the west side, Portugal to the east side. That would solve the problem. So this becomes an official treaty that both sides accept, and most European governments accept, at least for the short term. And it's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. So it literally kind of splits the world in half. And there's a few funny things about this treaty, at least I find funny. Number one is this: the explorers don't even know where the land stops yet. They're just kind of poking and prodding around. They're just trying to map the coastline. They don't know how big these land masses are. And at this point, Spain, you can see on the map way up there at the top, that amount of territory in Spain thinks that they're going to eventually control these two gigantic continents that are many, 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 many times the size of original Spain itself. And they'll try to do it. They're not going to really succeed, but they'll try. And Portugal, an even smaller country, thinks that they're going to be able to colonize basically all of Africa, and they're going to keep control of it, occupy the place. And it'll be extremely difficult. And another kind of strange result of this treaty is that a part of South America actually ends up on the east side of the treaty, of the line, right? Because they didn't know that land was there yet. The Pope just drew a line down the middle and eventually cuts off this little eastern chunk of South America that ends up being a Portuguese colony, even though it's in the Americas. And Portuguese eventually colonized that and called it the colony of Brazil. So Brazil starts off as a Portuguese colony, and to this day, it's the only country in the Americas that has a Portuguese-based language. Most of the rest is Spanish and English and French, right? And it's just by an accident of geography. So, good with the map? Questions about the treaty at all? Nope. All right. Okay. Well, the Spanish, for the early decades of, say, the 1490s and the very early 1500s, they're mostly poking and prodding around what we call the Caribbean, like the Gulf of Mexico today, and the coastline around it, say from Florida to modern-day Texas and down into Mexico. They don't know where the land goes. They're trying to find out where rivers run and all that kind of stuff. So the early maps, if you ever look them up in a book, say a map drawn in like 1502 or something, has no idea where the land is. It's not, those maps aren't accurate really much at all. So it's a lot of kind of guesswork and patchwork and whatnot. But the Spanish start hearing stories from people they contact all around the Caribbean. They hear stories of these gold-laden empires. And Spanish want to find those empires to steal the gold eventually. Question?
Well, how did they have enough food for these really long voyages? Did they just hunt the local area, just eat whatever they find?
Well, when they leave Spain, they just load up their boat as much as possible.
It doesn't get rotten.
Well, that's one of the reasons that salt is so expensive and valuable. It keeps meat somewhat fresh for a longer period of time.
And how long were these voyages, like, on average?
Well, the original voyage took Columbus 2 months to go from Spain to one of these islands in the Caribbean. But as they start to map it out better and they start to learn about there's kind of specific streams of water that move in specific ways. And if you get into one of those kind of Gulf streams, you can go a little bit faster because the water moves faster. And the wind blows harder in certain areas. So it's part of the mapping process. Eventually they'll get it down. Within a couple hundred years, it'll be down to, I think, about 3 or 4 week voyage. But You ever been on a boat? I get seasick real easy. I can't even stand an hour of it. I can imagine days and days and days, like 4 weeks being on a boat. Oh. Some people do it. I was just reading stuff a couple weeks ago about this guy who starts off in England in, I think it's the very late 1500s, and he goes all the way to China, all the way around South Africa, all the way up to the Philippines. I think he stopped in the Philippines, and then went up to Japan. Ended up in Japan. And it took like 8 months or something. Oh, 8 months on a boat.
There was a pretty high death rate, right? So like storms and.
Well, storms, and if anyone gets on that boat that has a kind of incubating sickness, yeah, and there's a possibility of mutiny. The captain's making decisions that the crew doesn't like. Sometimes they just kill them. There's a book in the 1800s written called Moby Dick, which is basically a whaling group that starts off kind of near Boston and they just go all over the damn place. It's a novel, but the guy who wrote the book was an experienced sailor. And the book basically says that they spent 1.5 years wandering around all over the place and end up in the Indian Ocean. And I think they go east of Japan out to the Pacific. So yeah, they almost go around the whole world. But they're kind of wandering around looking for a certain whale. I mean, they're trying to find one whale in the whole oceans. Good luck with that. But it's pretty detailed. It takes weeks and weeks to read. It's a giant book. But there's some pretty detailed descriptions of what life on that boat is like. It doesn't inspire me to get on a boat anytime soon. But yeah, all the way up to threatening to mutiny and kill the captain. That captain's kind of a little bit crazy. Very crazy. But there's descriptions of like the guys that are on these boats, they develop their own societies, their own cultures, because they're away from everyone else for so long. And a lot of them can't even feel comfortable when they get back to the city. They don't feel comfortable in the city because it's so like alien to them. It's so weird. So a lot of them get back to the city and immediately start looking for the next voyage to sign up for. So they only stay in the city for a couple of weeks until they can set sail again.
And the majority of the people, like, were they like women also join
On the boats?
bring kids? Yeah.
No.
Just
No,
men.
this is usually men that this is like say it's like joining the Marines. This is a tough guy thing to do. This is a test of your endurance and your strength and your mental toughness to survive something like this. So every once in a while, a woman might be part of the voyage, but usually not. So it's a big macho, masculine type of thing to do. So, yeah. And they definitely don't want any kids around. I mean, they're usually pretty violent too. So yeah, maybe a captain would have his family on board, but most captains even avoided that. Does that make sense? That's why so many of the early explorers are all men, and they set up colonies that are mostly governed by men, and they're the only ones around. So they start intermarrying or at least raping native women. That happens pretty commonly. Yeah. Other questions? Nope. All right. All right, but they eventually hear about this Aztec Empire. But the first thing that the Spanish are really after in kind of poking and prying around the Americas, they're still looking for their westward passage to get to India. That's one reason they're poking and prying around so much the coastline. They're trying to find a river that will get them kind of through the land and get them to the other side, the Pacific side, so they can keep sailing and find their way to India. Does that make sense? And they'll spend huge amounts of effort constantly, especially in what we today call kind of Mexico and Central America, looking for some kind of passage through that land, and they never find it. And especially when they realize how big South America is, they can't find any way around that. But they're just constantly, for decades, searching for what they call the Northwest Passage. So that was their goal, was still to get to India. Then they start hearing stories about this gold-laden empire somewhere inland. And natives tell them that story. And that ends up being the Aztec Empire. And the Aztec are based in what is today Mexico City. Their capital city was Tenochtitlan. And the Aztec have been around for a couple hundred years. And they have accumulated a lot of power. And they have conquered neighboring groups. And they've gone imperial, basically. So the Aztec are not innocent themselves by any means. They've conquered neighbors. They have human sacrifice of their conquered enemies, especially prisoners of war. They're doing normally kind of brutal things that imperialists do. And in doing so over the past few decades, the Aztec have largely angered all of their neighboring tribes because they've conquered them and oppressed them and taken their valuables and taken prisoners. And those neighboring tribes, they hear rumors about these human sacrifices, but no one's kind of crazy enough to want to go into the Aztec city and witness this because they'd probably be killed too. So there's all kinds of disturbing rumors around about what goes on in the Aztec city, at least for outsiders. The Aztec, when they conquer a place also, they just completely oppress them. So they don't assimilate conquered people. They don't make them into equal citizens under the Aztec Empire or anything like that. They're conquered people and treated as such, just like the Romans had and different Greek cities that treated each other. It's pretty brutal, cutthroat types of politics. So a lot of historians argue that by the time the Spanish show up in this area, a lot of these people that the Aztec conquered, they're looking for an opportunity to rebel against the Aztec and overthrow them and proclaim their own independence again. And they've been waiting for that opportunity for sometimes years and years and years. So they're actively angry at the Aztec and looking for an opportunity. And the Aztec emperor, by the time the Spanish come around, is named Montezuma. And the Aztec have an interesting political system. They had an emperor who served for life, but when the emperor died, the nobility, the kind of landowning elite in the empire, they would come together and hold an election amongst themselves, amongst the elite, to choose the next emperor. So it's not a kind of monarchy where the king dies and the eldest son inherits. It's an elected monarchy. So Montezuma had a really good reputation within the Aztec. He was at first a kind of religious leader, and then he turned into a soldier and a general. So he had support from kind of several factions within Aztec politics. So he's a popular emperor until the Spanish come around. And a powerful emperor. Yeah. And the first time that the Aztec government starts hearing about these Spanish ships out there in the Caribbean aren't even until the 15 teens. So this is 25 years after Columbus, or Colon. Colon and Columbus are the same person. In the United States and Western Europe, his name was Italian, so it's Cristobal Colon, but it got kind of Englishized into Christopher Columbus somehow. But he's the same guy, did the same stuff. So this is 25 years after Columbus, whatever you want to call him. And they're kind of poking and prodding around what is today the east coast of Mexico. And some of the Aztec people and even some of the conquered neighboring tribes, they see these boats, and these Spanish boats are so huge. I mean, Aztec, they had their own little boats for kind of traveling around the coastline, but these Spanish boats are absolutely massive, and the Aztec government records describe them as, quote, mountains on the water. They can't believe that something that size floats. They've never seen anything like it before, and they can't believe their eyes. So right off the bat, the Spanish are like really intimidating to the Aztec. And Montezuma and his government keep those sightings secret because they don't want to panic their own people. Does that make sense? Does that sound familiar? Like there's a lot of accusations that the U.S. government knows about UFOs and aliens and whatnot, and they keep it secret because they don't want to panic us. They try to use the technology themselves and all that kind of stuff. So a similar kind of, from the historical records we have, the Aztec kind of internal government debates, they know that the boats are out there. They don't want to tell their own people. And again, the Spanish, at first they were kind of poking and prodding around, looking for this passage to the Pacific Ocean, this Northwest Passage, that would get them to Japan and China and India. That's their goal. Until they start talking to some inland tribes around, from the coastline and moving further inland. And the Spanish start hearing rumors about this city made out of gold. That's what the rumors literally sometimes say, and the Spanish write it down. The Spanish call this city El Dorado. The city that is literally, the buildings are made out of gold. The streets are paved with gold. So the Spanish start changing their priorities. The Spanish explorers, and Cortez is one of their big leaders, they stopped caring about getting to India. Number one, it's already proved difficult. It's been 25 years of looking for that passage. They haven't found it. So they're getting disappointed in that. And number two, who cares about going all the way to India? You got to sail another few thousand miles. All you have to do is find the city of gold and take out a few chunks out of a few buildings and go back home. You'd be rich forever. Does it make sense? So the new priority for these Spanish explorers is to find this city and get the gold. Because it's not as tough. It's closer, and you can make it back home faster. And possibly richer. So finding the lost city of gold is more appealing to Spanish explorers than trying to find that passage to eventually get to India somehow. Does that make sense? So they shift their priorities around. And the Spanish governor in, I think it was what is today Cuba, the big island in the Caribbean, appoints Cortez, this guy Cortez, to be the kind of lead the Spanish expedition inland to try to find out where that city is. And Cortez is obsessed with finding this thing. So he takes a couple hundred Spanish troops or so, and they land a boat, pack up and they start marching inland, and they find native guides that they'll pay them to kind of show them how to get to the city. Does that make sense? All right. And let's see, where's the landing point? Here along the coastline on this map called Veracruz. So it's a fairly long march. They start this in spring 1519. And I don't know if you've ever been to Mexico City, but it has pretty high elevation. And it's basically a lake up in the mountains. And that's where the Aztec capital city is. It's on an island system on top of the lake. Or within the lake, I guess. So Cortez's men go through this very arduous kind of exploration, this expedition. They don't really know where they're going. They have to trust these native guides to show them. And they're going uphill, thousands of feet in elevation, so the air is getting thinner than they've ever experienced before. At one point, they have to hike up between two active volcanoes. So this seems like really otherworldly, intimidating to the Spanish. And eventually, when they get to the city, they look down, they see the biggest city they've ever seen in their lives on top of a lake, and they just can't believe it. So the Spanish, a lot of them are very scared of this, and a lot of them are very religious and start praying to God to help them with all kinds of things. The Aztec, though... Oh, sorry, question?
I just want to know, how is that on top of the lake? Like, what do you mean when you say it was on top of the lake?
There are islands in a lake.
Oh, wow. It's a pretty big lake, right?
Oh, it's a giant lake. And they eventually ran out of land, the Aztec did, on their island, so they made man-made land, basically. They created these, like, grid structures out of clay and piled mud and dirt on top of it and laid it down on top of the lake and grow food on it.
So is it like...
So it was man-made farmland, basically.
So they were seeing...
Sitting on top of the lake.
The city from, like, a cliff, and they were looking down on the lake?
Yeah, they're up in the mountain, they look down and they see it below.
So it's kind of like in a valley?
Yeah, the lake is in a valley.
Okay.
Yeah, surrounded by mountains. So yeah, and the Spanish, and it's Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, has a bigger population than any European city that exists at that point. So the Spanish have never seen anything of this size before.
I think Cortez was with his whole army when he was going to...
Yeah, it's about 200 guys, 200 soldiers, and explorers and all that kind of stuff, adventurers. And they can't believe what they see. And of course the air is thinner, so they can't breathe as well, and it's a different kind of experience. And it's something that a lot of them were very scared of. Other questions? Nope. The Aztec for themselves, especially the leadership, are often very scared of this also. Scared of the Spanish because, number one, there's a kind of legend within Aztec culture of one of the early kind of like creator gods who had done some things the other gods thought were offensive, and so the other gods kicked this god named Quetzalcoatl out, kicked him out of the Aztec area, what becomes the Aztec area during the time of the gods. And when this god left, he said, I'm going to come back in a certain amount of time as a light-skinned, bearded human. And right at the end of that timeline, that's right when the Spanish happened to show up. So a lot of Aztec who have heard this legend and then see these Spanish guys coming to their city, they're very scared of this. They think that some of these guys might be like the living God come back to wreak vengeance on them.
And they predicted the time?
Well, it didn't really predict the time, but the Spanish happened to show up right when that timeline runs out. Does that make sense?
So it was a timeline of like the events of like when this person...
Yeah, when the god said he would come back after a certain amount of years, and right when those years...
Around that time.
Yeah, and so a lot of the Aztec they're like really, really scared that these Spanish, what we know as like Spanish explorers, they might be gods in human form. And gods that are really angry because they've been kicked out for so long. And the Spanish have what we today recognize as advanced technology, which a lot of Aztec often interpret as like supernatural powers. They traveled in floating mountains. The Spanish come in with, they have a couple horses with them, and horses are not native to the Americas. Aztec have never seen, they've seen animals of that size, but not humans riding them and controlling them. And the Spanish have something like, I think it's like 20 muskets or something like that. So 1 out of every 10 of the Spanish soldiers have a gun. And the Aztecs still fight with swords and bows and arrows and spears and whatnot. So the Spanish point their weapon, they fire the gun, and destruction happens far away, and the Aztec look at that as like magic. They just point their spear at something and something gets blown up. So the Aztec are often very afraid of this because they don't have access to gunpowder weaponry yet. Does that make sense? And even the Spanish government leaders are very careful in what they say and do related to these Spanish guys. So even as Cortez and his men are still kind of hiking toward the city, the Spanish government has their spies out there that come back and give reports to the come back and give reports to the Aztec government. So the Aztec government is kind of up to date on where the Spanish explorers are on the trail coming to the city. And Montezuma eventually decides to give a bunch of gifts to the Spanish. Give them some jewels, some carvings, some sculptures, and hope that that will be enough to convince these Spanish people, or these gods, whatever they are, that they'll be happy with that and they'll go home. Because in Aztec politics, that's often what you did. In giving a gift to another politician, it would be like saying you have power over them. And when they accept the gift, that's like saying that they are weaker. And they kind of withdraw. They pull back. Does that make sense? In Aztec politics. But Spanish politics are the exact opposite. They come out of feudalism. When giving a gift is a sign of weakness, the person giving the gift is like offering something and bowing down to the person that's receiving the gift and saying, you're more powerful than me, and please accept this. So Cortez, coming out of Spanish culture, sees gift giving as a sign of weakness. So the Spanish accept the gifts with their cultural assumption that this empowers them. So they keep marching toward the city, and that confuses the hell out of the Aztec. Because usually when you accept a gift in Aztec culture, that means you're pulling back and going home. So the Aztec are completely confused about what's going on, which is often a kind of perspective that the textbooks won't give you. And of course, as they go through this whole area, the Spanish made deals, political deals, with the other kind of tribes around, that if the Spanish declare war against the Aztec and invade, then these other neighboring groups hate the Aztec. They'll join with the Spanish in the invasion to destroy the Aztec, so they can get their own independence again. Does that make sense? No? No. These other groups want to overthrow the Aztec occupiers, basically, and they're making deals with foreigners to accomplish it. So, here's an image of one of the Spanish guys drew an image of the lake that they saw, and then the kind of size of the city relative to the lake. So this obviously isn't to scale. This is one of the Spanish guys' kind of artistic interpretation of the Aztec capital city, Tenochtitlan. And in their desperation, now that the Spanish, they're right on the coastline of the lake, the Aztec government has to decide what to do. So they decide to invite the Spanish into the city. And that appears to be a government decision that, let's bring them into the city. At that point, we can find out whether or not these beings are humans or gods. If they're gods, then we'll have to appease them. If they're humans, we have 500,000 people living in the city. There's only 200 Spanish guys with only a few guns. If it comes down to a fight, we can just overwhelm them and kill them. So once you invite them into the city, the Spanish become trapped in the city. And when you're talking about a city that's built on islands within a lake, there's only 3 bridges out. So if the Aztec government just puts its troops on the bridges, they literally trap the Spanish inside. They can't get out. Does that make sense? All right. So this is going late into the year in 1519. So the Spanish have been traveling inland on this hike for, 6 months or so. It's been quite a long time. 6, 7 months. Does that make sense? All right. And Montezuma himself meets with his entourage, his bodyguards and whatnot. They meet with Cortez and his kind of circle of guys. And they have lunch a few times in public, in the city. And Montezuma seems to be like negotiating how to avoid war and how to get the Spanish to, just leave and never come back, basically. Montezuma, though, his big problem is that he has some military guys in his leadership that argue we should just take our chances and try to kill all these foreigners, and we'll find out if they're gods or men. And if they're men, we'll just wipe them all out, problem solved. If they're gods, we'll have a bigger problem to deal with, because it's tough to kill a god. So a lot of the Aztec military, they want to launch an attack and just try to wipe them out, problem solved. There are other politicians within the Aztec government that are more conciliatory. It's more negotiation-based type of guys who say, let's not take a risk, let's find out what they want, hopefully we can give it to them and just leave and never come back. And in these meetings, these personal meetings, Cortez seems to kind of intuitively start to realize that Montezuma is indecisive. He can't decide really which way to go. And Montezuma is being pushed and pulled by his own advisors. And at one of these lunch meetings, when Montezuma actually left his bodyguard behind and goes into this kind of restaurant, basically unarmed, Cortez is there with some of his guys, and they have guns, and they actually take Montezuma prisoner. They put their guns on him and say, don't move, and you're now a prisoner of Spain, which is like a ridiculous thing to say when you're so heavily outnumbered yourself. So they take Montezuma back to the house where the Spanish are living. They kind of put him under house arrest, under their own guard. And they try to intimidate Montezuma to give him some gold and let him go. Does it make sense? And they allow Montezuma to talk to his leaders, because if Montezuma makes the decision to give him the gold, he has to communicate that to his government to actually make it happen. Right? But a lot of historians argue that Montezuma is really in an impossible political position. His government's divided about what path to follow. Should they attack or should they negotiate?
Why is called Montezuma II?
Because there was another emperor before him named Montezuma. Yeah. Just like today the Queen of England is named Queen Elizabeth II because there was an Elizabeth I before way long ago. So Montezuma, he's really indecisive. He's trying to figure out which way to go. Attack or negotiate. And the problem with that is whichever of the two paths he chooses, he's going to piss off half of his government, right? If he chooses to attack, he's going to piss off the people who want to negotiate. If he chooses to negotiate, he's going to piss off the people who want to attack. And many historians argue that Montezuma is basically acting like a politician at this point. He's in a political conundrum. And like many politicians, when they're faced with a big choice like this, a lot of them look to delay the choice as long as possible and hope that some kind of circumstances will arise where it makes the choice obvious. So Montezuma is one of these kind of in-the-middle politicians that keeps pushing off a decision as much as he can. Does that make sense? No? And that doesn't work out really too well for him. Moving on. All right. Oh, okay. Well, before we get to that point, as he's trying to make his decision, he eventually decides to give a big speech. He's still under house arrest, so he climbs up on the roof of the house, and a bunch of the Aztec leadership are kind of standing in front of the house, listening to him talk. and apparently started saying something that one of the Aztec leaders didn't like. So they take a big rock and they throw it at him, and they hit him in the head and kill him. So he's assassinated by his own leaders. So that's the end of him. He dies in early 1520. And then the Aztec leadership, they get together and they elect a new emperor, as was normal for their political system. And they elect a guy who is a pro-war guy. So at this point, the Aztec government, under this new emperor, attacked the Spanish. And the Spanish fight for their lives in the city. And a bunch of them are killed. Most of them are taken prisoner. And they're put into an Aztec jail. And the Spanish have heard all these rumors of human sacrifice, so they're looking to get out of jail as fast as they can. So one night, I think it's June 30th, at about midnight, the Spanish go into a plan to break out of the jail and get the hell out of the city, as many of them as can possibly escape. So a bunch of them break out and they attack the bridges, and Cortez and a bunch of them do get out, and they run into the mountains to get away. Not all of them get out, though. Some of the Spanish are left behind or they couldn't escape, and they are executed. But the Spanish who got out eventually make it back to their boats that are parked on the coastline. They're taken in by the native groups around the area that the Aztec had kind of oppressed for sometimes years and years. So the Spanish tell these native groups, we're going back home, we're going to come back with an army, and then we're going to invade the Aztec, and we're going to conquer them, and if you fight with us, we'll free you. Well, you'll be free. So a lot of these other groups that hate the Aztec, they're all up for this, and they're just waiting for the war to begin. And the Spanish eventually get on their boats at Veracruz. They go back to their base at what is today Cuba, and they come back with warships and a few hundred soldiers and a couple of cannon and more rifles, basically, more musket. And they launch an invasion that is assisted by a lot of these other native groups that hate the Aztec. And by the summer of 1521, so this is a year after they escape from the city, they make it back to the city, and they ask the Aztec to surrender, and the Aztec don't. So they set up their cannon up in the mountains, and they just shoot cannonballs down onto the city until the Aztecs surrender. And the Aztec have no way to fight back against something like that, so they eventually do surrender, just after having their city bombarded. Does that make sense? And that's how the Spanish conquer not just the city, but they'll eventually conquer the whole empire itself and just start stealing as much gold as they possibly can out of it. And this is what makes the Spanish government hugely rich. And they enslave almost all the natives of the area eventually. But a lot of historians ask, how is it that 200 Spanish soldiers with some help, how can they overthrow a city of maybe 500,000 people? So historians have written many books and essays on that question. So some of their arguments are pretty straightforward. Number one, the Aztec had an opportunity to kill off the Spanish, but they're so afraid of that legend of this god coming back. They're so afraid that the Spanish were living gods that they didn't want to attack when the opportunity was probably best to wipe out the Spanish explorers. Also, the Spanish invasion hits in the springtime, right when a lot of the the Aztec soldiers are out in the farms, kind of growing the food. So if you've got no food supply, then everyone's going to starve. So that weakened the Aztec army, because so many of the soldiers had to be on the farms, growing the food that society eats. Also, the Spanish come in, and the Spanish have smallpox and other diseases that they quickly realize these native groups have never been exposed to, so they don't have immunity to it as much as the Europeans do. So especially smallpox spreads like wildfire throughout the native communities and wipes out a huge amount. It's basically a giant plague. And the soldiers didn't die of the sickness, were definitely weakened by it, so they're not really in a prime fighting capability. And the Spanish have a few muskets, but the big difference seems to be the cannon that the Aztec couldn't fight against. Some historians point out that Cortez knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to take, obviously, great risk to get it, and that's the goal. Whereas the Aztec leadership was constantly divided and kind of arguing amongst itself. Some historians argue that these Spanish conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors, went into these invasions with almost like a win-win kind of strategy or belief. They seem to think that they're going to go into this war, and either they're going to win and survive on the battlefield and win the war, and they're going to conquer this place, and they're going to steal gold out of it and get really rich. So that motivates the Spanish conquistadors on one side. Or they say on the other side, maybe you get killed on the battlefield, but they say you're also fighting to spread Christianity to all these new parts of the globe. So if you're fighting to spread Christianity, and just like the Crusades, if you die in that battlefield, you're doing God's work. God will let you into heaven immediately. So it's like either you're going to win the war and survive and get rich, so you can build your own little heaven on earth, or you might lose the war and die, but you go into heaven automatically. So either way, it's a win-win for you. Does that make sense? So some historians argue that motivated the Spanish to take really big risks on the battlefield against overwhelming odds. Because if you get killed, you get into heaven. And other historians argue that it wasn't just the Spanish who launched these attacks. They have help from all these different native groups that hate the Aztec and want to contribute to destroying the Aztec to regain their freedom. So it wasn't just 200 Spanish soldiers. They had hundreds and hundreds of other native soldiers that were kind of in an alliance with them. Does that make sense? All right, moving on. Okay. So that's one side of it, Spanish conquering the Aztec. A much quicker story happens with the Inca, which is another Native American empire in the western part of South America. And the thing to realize about the Aztec and the Inca, they never heard of each other before. They never knew that the other existed. So when the Spanish conquered the Aztec in 1521, the Spanish can learn from that experience and try it again in another place. But the group in that other place, the Inca, they never hear the history of the Aztec invasion. They didn't even know the Aztec existed. So the Inca are left to kind of try to figure it out as they go, whereas the Spanish now have like a model of conquest that they'll basically follow. So the Inca first start hearing rumors about these Spanish coming down from the north in 1525, so several years after the Aztec had already been conquered. And the sitting Incan emperor actually dies that year, and that starts off a civil war within the Incan government. Two different parts of the family raised armies and attacked each other to see who would be the next emperor. So that civil war is going on while the Spanish start coming into the area. So the Spanish have another divided government to fight, and they know it.
Wait, so it was the Portuguese about the Spanish, or is that?
Oh, they first hear about the Portuguese kind of sailing around the area in 1525. Yeah. And the Spanish come in a few years later in the late 1520s, early 1530s. That's right. The eventual winner of that civil war is named Atahualpa. And really, right at the point when he's decisively winning the Civil War, that's when the Spanish come into the area. So the Spanish hear about this Civil War and they look to take advantage of it. And Atahualpa's kind of new administration, his new government, its immediate problem is, what are we going to do about the Spanish? And his first action seems to be to send messages to the Spanish. What you're hearing is wrong. I've actually won the Civil War, and we are a unified government again, and you better get away from us because we know how to fight. And he says, you're in hostile territory, basically. You better go home. But the Spanish leaders, having none of that, this guy's name in this expedition is named Pizarro. And Pizarro learns the lessons from the Aztec invasion, especially the lesson of disease, smallpox. And says, the Spanish should basically attack now, while the Civil War is maybe ongoing, and we should use smallpox, the disease, basically biological warfare, to help us as much as possible. So the Spanish quickly attack one of the northernmost Incan cities called Tumbes. And the Inca hear about that, and they're basically preparing for war to kick the Spanish back out. In the fighting at Tumbes, several Spanish soldiers are killed, so it's quickly obvious that these guys are not gods; they're human, and so the Inca have some confidence in being able to kill them off to stop the invasion. But the Incan emperor sent a message to Pizarro, we want to avoid war, so let's pick some place kind of between Tumbes and the Incan capital, and we'll have like a negotiating meeting and try to figure out some kind of way to avoid conflict. And Atahualpa also sends a bunch of gifts to Pizarro and his men, which they accept, and then basically ignore all the threats that the Incan government was sending to them. So the Spanish are up in this town, Tumbes. The Incan capital is at Cusco. So they pick a town in between called Cajamarca. And the decision is that Atahualpa will personally go there with his bodyguard. And he will meet with Pizarro and try to find a way to avoid conflict. And the story is that Pizarro shows up to the town first at Cajamarca. And so he goes into a building and tells his men to basically, all of his soldiers, to basically hide throughout the city. And Pizarro stays in the building, and he has a Spanish priest with him. Catholic priest. And then Atahualpa and his entourage, his little army, shows up. And Atahualpa tells his army, stay outside the city, because this is a negotiation, this isn't fighting. And he basically says, I'm going to go in there with my negotiators, and if we get in trouble, if they attack us, come and help us. But this is supposed to be peaceful, so he leaves his army outside of the town. And the story says that Atahualpa enters the town with his advisors, unarmed, no bodyguard, and Pizarro sends the priest out first to kind of introduce himself, and the priest kind of tries to talk with them through a translator and whatnot. Doesn't really work very well. And the priest has a copy of the Bible with him, so he hands the Bible to Atahualpa, written in Spanish, or written in Latin. Atahualpa kind of flips through it, can't read it, doesn't understand what the words mean, doesn't read the language, so he passes it down to his advisor, and they kind of look at it. Last advisor kind of looks at it and just tosses it aside, throws it in the dirt, which the priest interprets as like an act against God, and so the priest gets really scared and kind of runs off. And at that point, Pizarro orders his soldiers to come out of where they're hiding in the town and basically attack Atahualpa's negotiators and basically kills them all. Takes Atahualpa prisoner himself, but massacres the rest of the advisors right there in the street. And reportedly, it is so brutal what happens that it scared the Incan army that are watching this, and they say, we don't want to get involved with this. These guys are crazy. So the Incan army refuses to intervene to save their own leadership. And there's a few famous paintings of all this at Cajamarca. So some textbooks will call this the Battle of Cajamarca. It's not much of a battle, it's a slaughter. And now they have the emperor prisoner. And in a Spanish prison, basically, in Incan territory, they hold him prisoner. And Atahualpa asked, well, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want if you let me go. So Pizarro's demand to Atahualpa is to fill, 4 rooms from floor to ceiling full of silver and 2 rooms full of gold as a ransom payment. And there's actually gold and silver mines really close in basically the Andes Mountains, right on the Incan border. So they have a lot of gold and silver accessible. So they actually do it. So Atahualpa has his government pay the ransom demand, and then the Spanish execute him anyway. So they take all the wealth and they kill the emperor anyway, and then the Spanish launch a full-scale invasion of all the Incan Empire and conquer the whole place outright within 2 years. Yeah.
Who gets the gold?
Pizarro and his men do.
It doesn't go to the government at all?
Well, a bunch of it goes to the Spanish government, but when the Spanish government relies on you to report how much gold you found, find 100 pounds of gold, maybe only report 90 or 95, or maybe only 40, who knows?
The Spanish government didn't send any spies to around, so they could actually get that.
The problem with dealing with gold is that, especially in another part of the world, the spies aren't reliable. They're easy to buy off when you're dealing with this much money, especially when they're so far away from the Spanish government that they can take that gold and they can set sail to Africa or India or somewhere else and just disappear forever and never get caught. Does that make sense? But that'll always be a big problem within the Spanish government. It's just what we call that kind of leakage of money, just through embezzlement, basically, theft. And the Incan Empire, they didn't even make money out of gold or silver. They had all these gold and silver and other kind of jewel mines and whatnot because they're so close to the mountains. They didn't view gold and silver as valuable. And they didn't really know why the Spanish, they seem to have the Spanish told them that the Spanish have a disease and the only cure is gold. They have like a physical disease. And eventually they basically enslaved virtually every single Incan person and send them off to the gold mines and work a lot of them to death. Something like 1 out of every 6 miners in the Incan Empire dies in the mine. So it's massive oppression and enslavement of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. all for gold, for wealth. And this is how the Spanish government gets to be so powerful. They just start sucking and stealing as much gold out of the Incan and Aztec areas as they could possibly get their hands on. And suddenly Spain is the most powerful country in the world. And they will be for the rest of the 1500s. So other historians have tried to figure out, well, how the Spanish, with a few hundred soldiers, basically conquer all the Incan Empire so quickly. Number one, there's an Incan political split, the Civil War, and they have to deal with the smallpox epidemic, which Spanish already learned about by dealing with the Aztec. Pizarro knew the history of the Aztec invasion, knew what kind of tools he could use to overcome and oppress such a large population so quickly, and he used it. And the Inca had never even heard of the Aztec, so they didn't know the history of what the Spanish had done there. They didn't know, they couldn't come up with new strategies for resistance. And the government leader, the emperor, Atahualpa, believed that, they want a ransom, give it to them, they'll go away. Which the exact opposite happened. That just made them want more. Paying them all that gold and silver just inspired them to go for everything. And the Incan Empire started off kind of small, but they conquered a bunch of native groups up and down the coastline. But the Incan conquest historically was very different. The Inca had a policy called matima, this word down here in the bottom right. That is basically, when you conquer a people, you offer them citizenship in your empire. You make them into equals. So they're not occupied, they're not conquered people. They're the same as all other Incan peoples. And the Inca had done this for hundreds of years. To many, many different groups. So the Incan Empire is really a patchwork of many different cultures, many different language groups, but they were all equal citizens. So perhaps the Incan government figured, well, even if the Spanish conquer us, they're going to allow us to be equal citizens within this larger Spanish empire. That didn't happen. They're almost all enslaved and worked to death to an extent you could get close to calling genocide. Does that make sense? So perhaps they had some confidence in that they would be treated well, or the Spanish would at least be honest with them. And that didn't work because the Spanish are not honest with them. The Spanish are vicious conquerors. To a point where they take over probably the wealthiest two empires in all of the Americas. And once Spain starts taking all that gold out of the Americas, that inspires the English and the French and the Dutch and other groups to get involved in colonization and to look for other native groups that have a bunch of gold. But the Spanish got there first, so the English and the French and the Dutch, they'll be kind of looking around in North America, in what is today Canada and the United States, because the Spanish have already gone into Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America. So the North American colonies that start like the 13 colonies of the British that turn into the United States, you've heard of this? Those were actually just the kind of leftover territories, because the English and the French and the Dutch, they don't get there till the early 1600s. They get there 100 years late. The Spanish have already taken up the most valuable areas, or conquered the most valuable territories.